Hello there, I'm Amira David. This is Boom Bust, and these are the stories we are tracking for you today. Annual wages in Australia are growing at their slowest pace in over 20 years, 2 decades, as one of the country's biggest mining companies slashes its dividend by 75%. I've got the details on that coming right up. Then Carl Denninger is on the show. We'll talk to him about that Apple encryption debate that everyone is talking about right now. With all the security tools that the U.S. government has, why can't it just hack into this iPhone on its own? He'll weigh in. Plus, in today's Big Deal, Ed Harrison and I are talking about low bank earnings and what they say about how close we are to a recession. All that and more is lined up for you on today's show. Don't go anywhere. Boom Bust starts right now. All right, well, we don't cover Australia all that much on Boom Bust, but as a large commodity producer, there's certainly no shortage of news coming out of the country. Today, that news was all about annual wages, which data now shows grew at their weakest rate in almost 2 decades. According to figures released by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, annual wage growth fell to just 2.2% in 2015. It was just above the inflation rate of 1.7%, adding to concerns that incomes are now falling behind the cost of living. The news comes as resource companies continue to scale back operations in hopes of keeping pace with slumping commodity prices. Just this week, Australia-based mining giant BHP Billiton slashed its mid-year dividend by 75%. to 16 cents a share after announcing that it had lost about $5.7 billion for the last 6 months of 2015, its first decline in almost 16 years. Although Australia's economy is still growing, the pace of growth in the wake of a decade-long mining sector boom has been moderate at best. To counter the slowdown, the Reserve Bank of Australia has cut interest rates to record lows, which has helped boost the housing construction sector, but the latest data is now adding weight to the speculation that Australia will move to introduce more easing measures in the near future. Since the end of last year, several European countries have implemented temporary border controls to stem the flow of refugees. There are currently more border controls than ever, but they're not quite creating the outcome that leaders are hoping for. Boom Bust, Bianca Fascini has the details.
In just the past week, 5 countries installed new border controls in hopes of limiting the amount of refugees in Europe. Austria, Macedonia, Serbia, Croatia, and Slovenia have decided to stop accepting Afghan refugees. They claim this is part of a plan to only accept people from war-torn countries, which they don't consider Afghanistan to be. But according to the United Nations, 71% of Afghans surveyed say they were fleeing conflict, and 19% said they never lived in their home country and were displaced before beginning their journey to Europe. We've seen a similar debate before over whether those fleeing to Europe are refugees of war or so-called economic migrants looking for a social safety net.
But instead of staying in this safe country, instead of staying in Turkey, they choose to travel through 6, 7, 8 safe countries in order to arrive here in the Netherlands or in Germany or in Scandinavian countries. And not for their safety, because they were safe in Turkey, but for the social welfare system we have here.
Even if that theory is proven wrong, authorities remain committed to decreasing the influx no matter what. But in February alone, around 43,000 refugees arrived in Greece, and that monthly average is expected to climb as the weather gets warmer. EU leaders have had a difficult time creating a cohesive solution to the refugee crisis. The disarray is currently causing chaos among borders and is threatening the future of the Schengen Agreement more than ever.
absolutely is, and we know they are heavily debating that, European officials, what they are going to do about the Schengen zone. But I want to ask you, I mean, the refugee crisis is often talked about within the confines of Europe, and rightfully so, but what about the U.S.? I mean, what kind of economic impact do we know of that this could have on the U.S.?
Right. So as we were just saying, obviously the biggest economic impact that could take place in Europe is if the Schengen agreement is just completely eliminated,
Right.
then it's going to affect trade and tourism and commuting. And that, as a result, could have an effect on the U.S. because some of our biggest trading partners are EU countries. And if that affects us, we could lose billions of dollars over the next 5 to 10 years. Of course, these are just estimates now. Who knows how it's going to play out? But if they don't come to some sort of solution, it feels far away right now because we're across the pond, as they like to say, but it will affect us.
It absolutely will. It's a ripple effect, and it's amazing what can happen in a highly globalized world. All right, Bianca Ficini, thanks for that. I appreciate it. To get his take on the FBI versus Apple encryption battle, Carl Denninger is on the show. Carl is the publisher of the Market Ticker and also former CEO of MCSnet. The FBI ordered Apple to create what some people are calling a backdoor to the iPhone. In a recent piece, Carl said the FBI actually has no authority to compel Apple to do what it's asking. So I first asked for his rationale behind that. Here's what he had to say.
Well, we have this thing in the United States called the 13th Amendment, which says that no person, other than someone being convicted of a crime, can be compelled to perform what amounts to slavery or involuntary servitude. And it doesn't matter whether or not that person's being paid. The offer to pay has nothing to do with the question. The question is whether or not Apple can be compelled to perform some kind of labor that it doesn't want to perform. The All Writs Act, which is what the FBI is attempting to use to justify this, is a law that predates the 13th Amendment, and so the 13th Amendment would supersede it. And in addition, that's a constitutional amendment as opposed to just a statute. So the argument has always been that you can compel, for example, a phone company to let you put a recording device inside their central office. And that's a very small thing. All you're asking them really to do is open the door and let you in there to put your device in. This is a different thing entirely. You're talking about a company being essentially compelled to perform thousands of man-hours of labor, including testing, and then produce this thing that they don't want to make. But to some degree, Apple has kind of put themselves in this position on their own. So there's a lot of push and pull from people that don't understand the technology here. And this is part of the reason that it's now wound up in the public.
What do you mean by Apple has put themselves in this position? Talk about that.
Well, Apple could have designed the iPhone's startup code, the bootloader that starts the phone up, so that it would not accept a software update if it was locked. And if you tried to force it, it would erase all of the encryption keys. That would make the request that the FBI is trying to serve them with an impossibility. You can't be compelled to perform an impossible task.
Okay.
But, yeah, so Apple wants to retain that ability to do that, to update software, possibly without your consent, and so do the phone companies. And so now you've got this situation where, well, the capability is there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, let's be clear about what a backdoor actually is for our viewers that don't really know what that means. How is something like that created?
Well, in this case, what the FBI wants them to do is turn off the automatic erase after 10 bad password attempts. So there are only 10,000 possible combinations of a 4-digit password. And guessing 10,000 times doesn't take all that long. So if you shut off the automatic erase, then there is no security on a 4-digit password at all, because anybody could guess it given a couple of days.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now, computer security expert Bruce Schneier says there's nothing preventing the FBI from creating that backdoor, from creating that hacked software that you really need to get into this phone, aside from budget and manpower issues. I mean, with all of the surveillance and security software agencies like the NSA, why couldn't the government just do it on its own?
They could, but there is a problem with that. And that is that if you want to actually use the data that you obtain to prosecute people, and remember the FBI is a law enforcement agency, you have to be able to prove in court that what you recovered is what was actually originally there. So if you hack into something without the company's support, you may destroy the necessary chain of custody that you need to use that to prosecute people. And I'm sure the FBI is sensitive to that, and it's part of the reason they want Apple to help them.
Well, at least one person has offered to hack this phone, and that's John McAfee. Last week, he told reporters that his team could decrypt the information on the San Bernardino phone, that it would take 3 weeks to do so, and that if he couldn't do it, that he would eat his shoe on live TV. It got quite the headlines. Needless to say, he's very, very confident that he could do this. Do you buy it?
Maybe. The easy way to do this is steal the signing key so that you can put a software update on the phone. The harder way is to find a way to trick the device, which is essentially what he believes he can do. I have not looked at the iPhone software that is under question, this particular revision, in enough detail to know how difficult that would be. But certainly you could potentially trick an application into getting some of the information. The problem is the FBI wants it all. But if for example, you wanted just the call logs and the contacts or the text messages, there may be an application on that phone that has that access. And so if you could trick that application into updating, then you could also trick it into updating it to one that would just send what you wanted.
Right. The point is that he's saying you can do this on an individual basis, that you can crack into just this specific phone. So that seems possible at the very least, right?
Maybe. I kind of think I'd be watching him eat his shoe.
And wouldn't that be great television? Okay, well, lots of companies are taking sides on this debate. Many tech companies, not surprisingly, are siding with Apple. But interestingly, one person not fully siding with Apple is Microsoft's Bill Gates. A lot of people would likely find that surprising. What's your take?
I'm not all that surprised. Again, this comes back to who really owns the devices that you buy and the software that you put on them. Is it yours, or does the person that sold it to you retain the right to change it anytime they want without your consent? And although Bill Gates is no longer the primary mind, if you will, behind Microsoft, he's moved on, his operating systems have always supported the idea that someone can come in and modify them, specifically Microsoft, anytime they'd like. And in fact, the most recent ones for consumers, you can't shut that off.
Time now for a quick break, but stick around because when we return, James Galbraith is on the show. Senator Bernie Sanders has taken a lot of heat lately for his plans on how to resolve income inequality and unemployment. But is the criticism really fair? He'll weigh in on that. Then in today's Big Deal, Ed Harrison and I are talking about low bank earnings and what they say about how close we might be to a recession. That's on the other side. Stay with us. And as we go to break, here are the closing numbers at the bell.
Really good, thank you.
For decades, the American middle class has been railroaded by Washington politics. Big money corporate interest has drowned out a lot of voices. That's how it is in the news culture in this country now. That's where I come in. I'm Ed Schultz. I do the news on RT America. I'll make sure you don't get railroaded and you'll get the straight talk and the straight news. Question more.
Most people think to stand out in this business, you need to be the first one on top of the story, or the person with the loudest voice, or the biggest ratings. In truth, to stand out in the news business, you just need to ask the right questions and demand the right answers. Question more.
Four former top economic advisors to President Barack Obama and former President Bill Clinton are disputing the underpinnings of Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders' plan to overhaul income inequality and employment. One of those advisors, Austin Goolsbee, said this about Sanders' campaign team. He said they've evolved into magic flying puppies with winning lotto tickets tied to their collars. To get his take on that very colorful language, James Galbraith is on the show. James is a professor of government at the University of Texas, Austin. Edward first asked him to talk about why he thinks the criticisms against Sanders were unfair. Here's what he had to say.
Well, that letter is not a serious document. I read it through. It's a very short letter that they wrote. It claimed in let's say, imperative tones that there be rigorous analysis is the underpinning of this kind of discussion. And it failed to provide even the slightest indication of that. They simply hadn't done any work. They then relied upon their own high authority and epithets, such as you were just quoted, to make their case. So in my view, that was disreputable and then even abusive. I went, after seeing the letter by the four former chairs of the council, I went to read Gerald Friedman's paper and found it to be a very workmanlike exercise. It's 53 pages long, very transparent, and really quite conventional in its approach to the problem. And so I wrote a letter, an open letter back to the four former chairs of the council, suggesting that if they wanted to be the standard bearers of rigorous analysis, they should do some.
You know, Jamie, Nobel laureate Paul Krugman is perhaps the most popular liberal economist in the world today, and he used the letter that you're talking about by these former Council of Economic Advisor heads to write a series of posts excoriating Sanders and Friedman. You know, in one of those first posts, he writes, quote, in Sanders' case, I don't think it's ideology as much as being not ready for prime time, and also of not being willing to face up to the reality that the kind of drastic changes he's proposing, no matter how desirable, would produce a lot of losers as well as winners. This not ready for prime time criticism is one I've heard leveled against Sanders in the past. Do you think it's fair?
Well, with this, I think, was not Paul's finest hour, and probably best to leave it at that. Senator Sanders has been a public figure now for roughly 40 years, a member of Congress since, I think, 1988. He's a person with a great deal of experience in the public corridors of the United States. So the notion that he's not ready for prime time is, first of all, contrary to evidence, and secondly, obviously contrary to the political wave that's sweeping the country, which has propelled him from deep obscurity to contender status in less than a year. He's really quite a remarkable political development, however you look at it.
You know, the same kind of not ready for primetime criticism has also hit Republican frontrunner Donald Trump in the past, yet he's won 3 primaries on the trot and leads in the polls. What do you make of Trump's economic platform, however?
I'm unaware that there is such a thing. Donald Trump, I've watched him speak to these questions occasionally, and he seems to believe that bluster will carry him as far as he needs to go in the making of economic policy, which, by the way, is not the case for the Sanders economic program, which has a number of clearly articulated major platforms to it. So people are focusing on those. They're focusing on the conversion of our healthcare system to a universal single-payer system, on providing tuition-free public education at the university level, and on the other planks of the Sanders platform. And that is, I think, why so many people in the Democratic Party are moving in Bernie Sanders' direction.
Since you bring up Bernie Sanders, let me pivot back to and hone in again on Sanders, because Paul Krugman, he notes 3 specific assumptions in Gerald Friedman's analysis of Sanders' platform that Krugman says are simply not credible. Here they are. He says, real growth at 5.3% a year versus a baseline of around 2%. It's not credible. He also talks about the labor force participation rate back to 1999 levels, and 3.8% unemployment. Do you think these assumptions are problematic in any way?
The problem with Paul's assertion is that those numbers are not assumptions. They're not inputs to the Friedman paper. They are outputs to the paper. They're the results of the model estimation. And if you haven't got that distinction clear, then as a professional economist, it's fair to conclude that you haven't read the paper. What Gerald Friedman did was to take as I say, a conventional set of economic assumptions, to input the economic parameters of the standards program, let's say how much spending and taxing and other changes that were being proposed, and to draw out of that a set of numbers for the growth of real GDP, from which it followed, using very standard rules of thumb, that there would be a certain amount of additional employment and a reduction of the unemployment rate. So these are not assumptions at all, they're consequences. And what Paul Krugman and the four former chairs of the council appear to have done is to look at those consequences and say, well, hey, the future can't be that different from the past. Nothing can really change, and therefore we don't regard this as credible. Well, that again just shows that in order to understand what a paper does, it is helpful first to read it.
All right, big deal time. I'm sitting here with Ed Harrison, and we are talking about, we're going to continue the conversation actually that we started yesterday on bank earnings. Yesterday, we talked a little bit about banks potentially hiding losses when the earnings cycle for banks turns down, but just how down are they? That is the question. Ed, set the stage for us. How are these banks faring?
Yeah, so I've looked at some of the recent ones that have come out. I think pretty much all the big banks have come out now. The two or three most recent ones that I think are important to look at are JP Morgan Chase. Here's an example. Trading revenue there is down 20%. Bad loans in energy and mining are piling up. We even have a graphic of showing, not only how many losses that they've had, but how many more losses they need to take, which are greater than the number of losses that they've had. That's not the right chart there for that. But there's also HSBC, which is a UK company. The CEO there is overseeing losses for the first time ever. Standard Chartered, another UK company, the worst losses, the worst performance in 18 years.
Yeah.
And then Deutsche Bank, 6.8 billion with a B loss for 2015. That's in Germany.
Yeah.
So that tells you it's terrible.
Yeah, European banks in particular seem to be taking a hit. And with bank earnings faring so poorly, what does it really tell us about where we are in the credit and business cycle?
I think, I'm still of the mind that you could make the case that we're still mid-cycle. That, if we get through this oil and gas and through this mining stuff, then maybe you could have a reacceleration of credit growth. But, a lot of this stuff has the hallmarks of an end of credit cycle type of phenomenon, from my perspective.
Okay. Tell me about what else out there really indicates that that's the case. I mean, what specifically? I know I saw a report recently on auto loans going bad in the U.S. Can that really signal anything to us about that?
Yeah, so on my paper here, I have something that was from Wells Fargo. They say that delinquencies on subprime auto loans packaged into bonds in January were 4.7%. That's a level that we haven't seen since 2010. They also said the default rate is already climbing up to 12.3%. Up from 11.3%. This is a month-to-month change of 1%. That's also the highest rate since 2010. So subprime autos are terrible. And let's remember that 4 out of every 10 loans for autos, credit cards, and personal borrowing went to the subprime market. So this is a huge market now, and that market is showing stress, both in terms of delinquencies and also in terms of defaults.
Okay, well, tell us a little bit more about the loan-to-value calculations on auto loans. What can you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, that's the interesting bit. If you look at the loan-to-value calculations for auto loans, they're enormous. The last time the OCC put them together, I think that was the chart that we had up there. What we saw is that they were on average 137% And so here's the subprime delinquency index. That was from the previous one. But, you know, what it says, 137% loan to value is that people are borrowing 37% more than their car is worth in order to make to make that transaction happen.
Okay,
and that's terrible.
Yeah, but that doesn't make any sense. 37% more than what the car is worth. Why would they need to borrow that?
Yeah, and this is on average. And you know, I'm talking about used cars here. Mm-hmm. The reason that they would do that is because number one, there's all sorts of protection and types of things, little bells and whistles that they add on to the price. Mm-hmm. But on top of that, they also have not gotten over the last loan that they've had for the car. So they're actually rolling up the last loan into the new loan. So let's say the car is worth 100%. You add on a bunch of little things for, say, 10 or 15%, and then you add on another 25% more from the previous loan that you had for your car, and now you're up to 137. And that number in 2014 was 150% for the average subprime borrower in the United States for cars.
Well, Ed, excuse the pun, but that sounds like an accident waiting to happen, does it not?
Exactly right.
Okay, going back to yesterday, I mean, how do you expect banks really to sort of deal with all these problems? We've got a host of problems here.
Yeah, so I think that there are two things. One is that, first of all, these banks actually have packaged these loans up into asset-backed securities the same way that they do with mortgage-backed securities. What we saw in the subprime crisis with mortgage-backed securities is that the banks, even though they took lots of losses, most of the losses were elsewhere. And then the second thing is that they're just going to hide the losses. They're going to delay, actually showing the losses until they absolutely have to.
Well, Ed, all of this explains why bank stocks are so low and probably continue to digress, unfortunately. Ed, thanks for weighing in on that. We love hearing from all of you guys, so tweet at us, Edward NH, Bianca Fascini, and Amira David. Remember, you can see all the segments featured in today's show on YouTube, youtube.com/BoomBustRT. From all of us here at Boom Bust, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.